One, but
This meeting is being recorded.
Good evening, everyone. Oh, I just lost myself. How is that? Oh, I see. It's my
Video off.
recording. Doy. Hi.
Yeah,
Welcome,
recording came on.
everyone. Welcome, everyone. This is Green Renaissance Sovereign Rights Movement, and tonight we'd like to speak about what's going on in Latin America. And we have a fantastic guest today, which is the author of a really comprehensive article, Roger Harris, and I'm going to turn this over to him, and he can tell us about his article and really what is going on in Latin America. Because while we're focused on Ukraine and we're focused on Gaza, and we're very focused on what's going on in the world, we also care very much about what's going on in Latin America and Africa as well. And it's important, and also Haiti. And it's very important to have speakers from other regions that can bring us up to speed on what the United States is doing. So with that, I'd like to welcome Roger Harris. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Gloria. And so this presentation is about the U.S. military projection in Latin America and the Caribbean, and it's been intensifying. It's not anything new. December 2nd of this year, last December 2nd, that marked the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is the U.S. Statement that it gave itself dominion over the rest of the hemisphere. We talk about the word the hegemony. Hegemony means to rule, with the emphasis on domination. And the United States has dominated the hemisphere for over 200 years now. We had a new president, Joe Biden, when he came in, and in his first foreign policy statement, he said, "America is back." He actually said it 3 times. And that marked an intensification of the U.S. imperialist thrust into the rest of the hemisphere. In just the last year, U.S. Marines and Special Forces landed in Peru, and that was in May. And they were invited there by the unelected right-wing government, which was the coup government. And then in October, the U.S. got the UN Security Council to approve the military occupation of Haiti using proxy troops from Kenya. Now, that still has not yet happened, but it seems like it's going to happen. Also in October, the right-wing government of Ecuador resorted to deploying U.S. troops on the ground to deal with domestic unrest. And last November, Mexico and Peru joined in annual U.S. naval exercises. And these naval exercises were not just simply training, it was a mock war. And what was the mock war against? It was against China. So those are just some of the things. It just scratches the surface of what's happening right now in the region. Diplomacy, probably some of you remember Kamala Harris. You probably haven't heard much from her anymore, because she began to be the face of the United States for diplomacy in Latin America, but not recently. The new face is a person by the name of Laura Richardson. Does anybody know who Laura Richardson is? She's a 4-star general. She's head of the Southern Command, and she's been very active in leading U.S. diplomacy. In fact, U.S. diplomacy now in Latin America is highly militarized. Not only is the military, the Pentagon involved, but so is the CIA. There's a woman by the name of Lisa Kenna. She is now the U.S. ambassador to Peru, to the Peru government. In fact, she was instrumental in helping the Peru government overthrow the leftist leader there a year ago last December. And Lisa Kenna previously was a CIA agent herself. So these are some of the things that are happening. It's a shift of the military, of U.S. diplomacy, from a diplomatic function with the State Department, not a great institution either, to a more, even more aggressive stance with the CIA, the DAA, Homeland Security, and particularly the Pentagon, involved in in U.S. foreign policy in the hemisphere. The U.S. is by far the largest source of military aid in the region. The United States has 76 bases in the region, and these are just the bases that they admit to. There are these, quote, unconfirmed operational bases. Unconfirmed operational bases. Those are bases that that they don't recognize. They don't tell us where they are and what they're doing. But these bases have very little transparency, and they're operating throughout the hemisphere. The U.S. military mission has evolved over time. And if you start with, let's say, just after World War II, the United States emerged as the world's single great hegemonic power. Had just dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Europe and Japan were decimated from the war, as well as the Soviet Union. So during that initial period, and that lasted till about 1991, when the Soviet Union imploded, the main U.S. mission globally, not just in Latin America, was the mission to combat communism. With the implosion of the Soviet Union in 1991, the U.S. military mission did not contract. In fact, it expanded. Because what we should see was that the U.S. military mission was always about domination. The fight against communism was just the cause du jour, but the main cause was the domination of the planet. Starting in 1991, the U.S. global military mission came to focus on the war on drugs. Now, this was particularly ironic because what is the major consumer of drugs in the world? That's the United States. Now, you would think that if you were the major consumer of drugs, that one way of ending the drug war would be to fight it by preventing drugs from getting into the country and being distributed. In fact, we never even hear about drugs being distributed in this country. It's kind of this thing, I'm sure all of you have heard about all these Latin American drug kingpins. But where do the drugs go when they get to the border? Do they throw them across the border and the Girl Scouts distribute them? We don't know. It's kind of an interesting thing. Also, throughout much of the post-World War II period, the two largest producers of drugs was Colombia in Latin America and Afghanistan in Eurasia, both of them under U.S. Domination until very, very recently. So then the drug war became important, but now after 9/11, then it became the war on terror and combating what they called TCNs, transnational criminal networks. That was in the early part of this century. And then now it is even a scarier mission. It's the mission of great power competition. Basically, what that means is competition with China, Russia, and to a lesser extent, Iran. China, as all of you know, has become a major economic power in the world. It is the second largest trading partner to South America, and second only to the United States. And the Chinese have an economic mission called the Belt and Road Initiative, and 21 of the 31 countries in Latin America are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. The Southern Command's military budget, the U.S. Southern Command, which has control over the hemisphere, that military mission, their budget has been ballooning. And when Laura Richardson, the head of the Southern Command, went before Congress and explained, why are you so interested in Latin America? And she just talked about the resources that the United States should control. And she explicitly talked about Venezuelan oil and all these other resources, lithium and stuff. And she didn't make any bones about it. The mission of the United States is to control those resources. And also, she argued that the Latin American theater is, quote, a nearby test bed, a nearby test bed. And she said, quote, it's a prime location for for experimenting with and testing new technologies. New technologies, she mentioned, that could be used against China in a even larger war. So the United States is using Latin America to practice war against China. That's not my interpretation. That is the Pentagon's interpretation of what is happening right now. The Southern Command, in particular, in the hemisphere, has targeted three countries. The three countries striving for socialism: Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. The US military tactics in the hemisphere have evolved. And let's go way back to the old days, the bad old days of the birth of imperialism. That's with the Spanish-American War, 1898, until the mid 1930s. Washington
Can
then.
I just say one thing? Could you define socialism in these countries? Because really, these countries are a mixed economy that is focused.
I think I used the term, the three countries are striving for socialism.
Because
Uh,
they're really mixed economies with a focus on humanity and supporting economic development and supporting land reform and just really good policies.
right.
I mean, in the United States, we seem to have socialism for corporations and capitalism for individuals. And these countries are actually the inverse.
So
So I just wanted to
in
clarify that.
China,
Thank you.
in Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba, these are countries that are striving for socialism. Their leading political parties consider themselves socialist, and but the achievement of socialism is something that is a process. It's not something that is just happening. And we can go into that maybe in the Q&A. But speak a little bit more about the developing tactics, because in the old days, talking about the first imperialist war, which was the Spanish-American War. That's the war that the United States took the Philippines, it took Cuba, and it took Puerto Rico. It still owns Puerto Rico, and it still has a big military base in Guantanamo, Cuba. And back then, the United States simply sent its military, sent the Marines, and took over the countries. Now, the US military penetration in the hemisphere has become more sophisticated. They're using proxy armies with mercenaries. A good example was John F. Kennedy's Cuba invasion in the Bay of Pigs in 1961. And then in Nicaragua, and this is something where John is a real expert on that, was the Contra War. Both the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Contra War, however, were unsuccessful from the point of the view of the US imperialists. Increasingly, though, in the last 75 years or so, the United States has relied on covert operations. And the CIA was founded in 1947. By 1954, the first sort of, quote, CIA coup was against the Arbenz government in Guatemala. That was a successful coup that overthrew the elected government in Guatemala. And then the U.S. fomenting coups have continued to the present. Most recently, the Venezuelans have uncovered 5 coup attempts in the last year alone. The US military missions have been expanding. What was the scope of the military activity? Now the US military takes on missions such as fighting forest fires and other climate-driven disasters. Now, these missions are not to be confused as environmental missions. What they really are is weaponizing the whole idea of environmentalism to further military gains. There's also what they call humanitarian missions. We're seeing what we're seeing right now, probably the worst thing in our lifetime of anti-humanitarian missions right now in Gaza. And then we've also seen perhaps another active thing in the hemisphere has been the fight against narcotics, the counter-narcotics thing. In addition to these overtly military things, the United States employs what we call hybrid warfare. And they use what the UN calls the unilateral coercive economic measures. These are also called sanctions. And these are not bombing countries, but these are as deadly as bombs in terms of their effects. And just let me mention a few of the really horrific effects. Sanctions on Venezuela, they were started by Obama, intensified by Trump, and seamlessly continued by Mr. Biden. And their toll has been devastating. Over 100,000 people have died from US hybrid warfare in Venezuela. 22% of the children under 5 are stunted. Over 300,000 chronic disease patients are without access to treatment in Venezuela. This is the hybrid warfare of the United States. And finally, I'll just conclude here, is that the United States is also returning to what you might call gunboat diplomacy, particularly in the area of Guyana, where there's a land dispute between Guyana and Venezuela. And that's become a real hotspot and an area where the US military is penetrating and trying to foment another war against Venezuela. And with that, I'll just conclude.
Thank you very much. Also, since we have John here too, would you like to say a few words about what's going on in Nicaragua right now? I mean, Nicaragua just did a very bold move, and I'm in awe of Nicaragua's move, and also concerned because they've really put themselves out there. Right now, we just have South Africa and Nicaragua who are objecting to what's going on in the genocide in Gaza.
Yeah, thanks, Gloria. If I could, I'd like to follow on from Roger, because Roger's article and what he's just presented is a very good comprehensive assessment of what's going on in Latin America. And of course, Nicaragua shows the evidence of all of these things happening. We had the coup attempt in 2018, which was kind of hybrid warfare. And we've had various kinds of hybrid warfare since then. And also bear in mind, of course, as Roger says, that Nicaragua is surrounded by US bases. Every neighboring country has US bases except Belize, which has UK bases, which are supplied by the US anyway. But the hybrid warfare attempts have included, really, I suppose, the most overriding one is the way that the US government and therefore the US media and international media portray Nicaragua as a dictatorship, as an authoritarian regime, as and all the rest of it, which you're familiar with. So it succeeded in changing the language about which people use to talk about Nicaragua. It's encouraged this image of Nicaragua through the international media. It's given money to local opposition media that originally were based in Nicaragua, now based largely in Costa Rica, who feed all of these negative stories to the international media. Very often people writing for international media like the Associated Press, like Reuters, like New York Times, are ex-workers of these local so-called independent media that were funded by the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID. It's carrying out sanctions, admittedly not as severe as the blockade which is taking place against Cuba or the much more severe sanctions against Venezuela. And one of the reasons for that is that presumably it doesn't want to encourage vast amounts of uncontrolled migration in the way that there is so much migration from the Northern Triangle countries in Central America. And until a couple of years ago, migration from Nicaragua was limited. Now the US has been encouraging migration through its so-called humanitarian parole scheme, which targets the brainiest people and the most active people in Nicaragua. Is really a form of brain drain of people going to the US, which is totally despicable, because obviously Nicaragua is the second or third poorest country in the hemisphere and badly needs its brightest people to run the country. There's been the campaign on human rights, which I wrote about most recently in Covert Action magazine, portraying Nicaragua as total abuser of human rights. And the US has used the United Nations machine through so-called group of experts on Nicaragua, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, the OAS, and other mechanisms in order to portray Nicaragua in this way. And I suppose, above all, it totally ignores, and the media totally ignore, Nicaragua's achievements during all this time. We've had 17 years of Sandinista government. The Sandinistas have built 25 new public hospitals in that period. They've built the best road network in Central America. They've converted the electricity matrix to over 70% renewables, and many, many other achievements. And of course, this isn't what you read about in the US media or anywhere else. So that kind
and
of
clean water too.
And clean water, yeah, and
Housing.
electricity coverage is almost 100%, whereas it was only about half that 17 years ago.
And education.
Indeed. So that just adds a little bit to of extra local detail to what Roger told us.
The only thing I would just like to say is that this isn't necessarily socialism. It is good government. It's government for the people, as opposed to government for the corporations and the predator class. It's fantastic. I mean, when you go there, it's just really an amazing country, and I recommend everyone in our group tries to get there at some point. And I hope to go back in July for the revolutionary celebration. So, and I hope I'll see you then. Does anyone have any questions for our speakers tonight? After the questions, I'll end the recording, and we can just have our regular Green Renaissance meeting. And if our guests want to stay and hang out, that's great. If not, that gives them a chance. I see Judith has her hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, what was his name, Roger? I'm sorry.
Roger Harris.
Harris, okay.
Yeah, Roger.
I wonder if you could, I don't know anything about the coup in Peru, was it? I wonder if you could explain that, please, just briefly.
Yeah, so Peru, there was a very interesting person, Pedro Castillo. And he was this person that almost nobody ever knew about. And he ran for president. And in Peru, they have first a runoff, and then the two top candidates run against each other. And he was the absolute dark horse in the in this runoff. He came from a party called the Peru Libre Party. It was a explicitly Marxist-Leninist party. He was a leader of a teacher strike, and amazingly, he came in second in the primary, the runoff election. Excuse me, in the first round of the presidential elections, and then he won the runoff election against Keiko Fujimori. I'm probably ruining her name. Her father is actually was in prison for human rights violation. He was a previous president of Peru and had done some horrible things, and he was rightly in prison for human rights violations. But she beat him. Pedro beat Keiko by a very slim number. And so he never had really a strong political strength in government. He was popular with the people, but not with the oligarchs. And finally, it's a complicated story, but he was overthrown a year ago, last December. He's now in jail, and a coup government that headed by a woman by the name of Dina Boluarte is leading the country. Subsequently, Peru has become very, very closely aligned with the United States, and there are U.S. troops on the ground occupying Peru, getting involved in some of the domestic issues. In particular, Peru has had a problem of out of control drug cartels, and they've caused a lot of violence, a lot of deaths. And right now, it's a very contested situation in Peru. And John, do you want to add anything?
Oh. Well, thank you. I do recall that now, but how was Pedro Castillo gotten rid of? Can you tell me that?
I'm sorry. How did he what?
How did they get rid of Pedro Castillo?
It was a parliamentary coup, and he was arrested by the military authorities. It was a complicated situation. There was 3 impeachment attempts. On the 3rd impeachment attempt, he constitutionally tried to dissolve the assembly, but the assembly beat him to it, and they arrested him and put him in jail. And
Okay, thank you.
since then, there have been huge popular uprisings, many people killed, and particularly strong in the uprising were poor and indigenous people.
And I'm not sure if my speaker's on.
Yeah, so is there any kind of an armed resistance faction in Peru?
Yeah, it's very, very strong, particularly in the indigenous communities, opposition, and there's been a tremendous amount of use of state coercive power to put that down. A substantial number of people have been killed in those popular demonstrations by the government.
We've seen a lot of lawfare. Do you guys want to speak a little bit about lawfare?
Yeah, lawfare is obviously a kind of a made-up word. It means using legal means to achieve what you might otherwise achieve by lawfare. So there's been many examples. Dilma Rousseff. Am I saying that? I'm not saying that right. How do you say Dilma's last name? Dilma Rousseff, something like that. She was president of Brazil, and she was deposed by a lawfare thing. The president of
Lula too.
Also deposed by lawfare, and Uruguay has a fairly right-wing government now. Back to Brazil, the former president of Brazil, who had 2 terms of presidency, he was put in jail and was not able to run 4 years ago. And then this right-wing person, Bolsonaro, won the election, and then Lula was subsequently freed, and he's now the president of Brazil. So throughout Latin America, the lawfare has been used as a means to depose left-leaning leaders. Right now, particularly, there's a conflict in Colombia. Colombia has, for the first time in the entire history of Colombia, it has a left-leaning government under the President Pedro Castillo. President Petro and his Vice President Marquez. I think I'm getting that close to right. But the Attorney General of that country has been using lawfare against Petro, and right now there's a standoff around the Attorney General. The current Attorney General has his term of office is over, but the Supreme Court, which is involved in choosing the new Attorney General in Colombia, they've been sort of deadlocked in getting a new Attorney General there. So throughout the hemisphere, there's been a lot of lawfare attempts against the left.
And I just want to say, when we say left and right, it gets very confusing, especially in the United States. When we talk about left in Latin America, we're talking about governments that are pro-human, pro-people. And that's really where it's at. Whereas the right in Latin America is really about the oligarchs and the corporations. And they're really, in my opinion, traitors to their nation. So it's not necessarily the same as in the United States, this kind of concept of left and right. It's more either you're humanitarian or you're not. And that's what I've observed. Gentlemen, anything?
Perhaps I could just make a comment on that. I recently interviewed the Nicaragua's finance minister. I interviewed him last October, and I was interviewing him about the effects of sanctions. And he had just presented the 2024 budget to Nicaragua's National Assembly. And it was very interesting that in the course of, I guess, about 45 minutes of conversation, he repeatedly said that the aim of the budget was to tackle poverty. And it was very interesting to me, coming from the UK, and I guess coming from the US would be similar. If you'd spoken to somebody in the finance ministry in a developed country, they'd be talking about balanced budgets or, maintaining the value of the dollar or the pound or something. They would be talking about economic indicators. And he repeatedly said that his main aim was to reduce poverty, and what he was proud of was the way that they'd done that in the past. And of course, what he was worried about sanctions was that the most pernicious sanctions so far have been on Nicaragua's access to multilateral loans from the World Bank and so on. And that, he thinks, has deprived the country of about $500 million of loans every year since 2018. So about between $2.5 and $3 billion in loans for development projects, which were aimed at the poorest communities since 2018 in total.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, John. I mean, when we look at the Nicaraguan budget and where the priorities are, in Nicaragua, the majority of the budget are for social welfare. This is also true in Venezuela. When we look at the United States, it's the inverse. The vast majority of the discretionary budget in the United States is for the military. That tells you an awful lot. And the United States is a very wealthy country, and Nicaragua and Venezuela are not wealthy countries, yet they manage to prioritize. And all governments say we're for the people, we're doing great things. But if you look where they put their money, you see countries like Nicaragua, like Venezuela, putting their money into social welfare, particularly education and healthcare.
I see John Olson has his hand raised.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'll take it from there if I may. Yeah, I agree with Roger and John, who are using socialist and left and right in the classic, authentic way. Sort of deriving from a Marxist analysis, but not in a rigid sense, certainly not Stalinist. And it's still useful in that context. Here, everything seems to be upside down, inside out, and backwards in the U.S. So the terminology, it used to be that the left was anti-imperialist and anti-racist and very, with very clear definitions, and the right was in favor of the imperial order. Now, a lot of those who used to be right-wing have woken up, and the so-called left has become woke in the nefarious sense of the term. And so the idea of left being in favor of benefits for the people, the education, the social welfare benefits, taking away power from the corporations, the cartels, and so forth. That's what is meant by left. And the right is that which supports the rich landowners and the military, and so that's the way the terminology is standard used, and I think that's how they're both using it.
There's an authentic left in Latin America. There isn't an authentic left in the United States,
Yeah, exactly.
in
Yeah,
my
that's
opinion.
what I'm saying.
Oh,
Well, there is.
Jeremy's
We
here.
are. I think we are kind of the. Yeah, in my opinion. Okay. All right. I'll relinquish. Take it from there.
Jeremy, is that Jeremy Kuzmarov?
Yeah, popped in. I just came home, so I said I
Oh,
would
we
pop on.
have two author, actually we have like three authors at Covert Action magazine here. And we have
yeah.
the managing editor, Jeremy
Oh, cool.
Kuzmarov.
Jeremy, I just heard you this morning on the Critical Hour. I followed you on that program this morning.
Oh, great. With Garland Nixon?
Yeah, with Garland.
Oh,
and
good. Yeah.
Leon.
Great.
So I heard the last part of your presentation, and then I came on.
Great. Oh, you were on the show too. Oh,
Yeah.
great. Oh, great. Yeah, well, great articles you've been writing. Yeah, actually, I quoted from you because I think next week we have an article on the 25th anniversary of the Bolivarian Revolution. So I referred to your piece. You had a piece on Venezuela and Latin America. It was good. Yeah.
And John was just saying that he had a piece that just came out too, right? Who?
Who?
You just had a piece that was in Covert Action.
Yes, Jeremy's just published a piece. Well, he's published several pieces by me about Nicaragua, but the latest one is about the human rights industry. What I did was take the excellent book by Alfred de Zayas, who's a human rights lawyer and expert worldwide, and applied his analysis of the so-called human rights industry, that's the title of his book, to the situation in Nicaragua. And I showed, I think very clearly, I hope very clearly, that all of his analysis of the human rights industry applies in this small country, as it does, of course, in Venezuela, in Syria, in Cuba, and many other places. But it's particularly relevant here in the recent past because of the coup attempt in 2018 and the way that so-called human rights bodies had a vital role in the publicity around that coup, in giving the impression to the media that the government were killing hundreds of students, which was simply a lie. But Desire shows in his book how these human rights bodies, both at local level, national level, and at international level through Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and through the official mechanisms like the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations, largely dominated by US policy, and give messages which fit in with US foreign policies.
I see Alana's hand up. Alana, would you like to say something?
I've been reading that Guatemala. I want to know what you all know about Guatemala, because I'm hearing that there's been a coalition of indigenous people and urban people, and that they have a new election, and it looks very positive. It looks like a very positive shift in the power structure there. Does anybody know about Guatemala?
There's been a you want to go on? John, or
No,
should I?
you go ahead. You probably know more about it than me. I mean, I know about the election of Arvello, who's the son of uh, left-leaning leader.
Jeremy, why don't you go on, please?
Well, I did an article about it. I mean, I think he's positioned himself as a kind of, he's not going too far to the left, but I mean, it is a departure from some of the previous leaders. And his father was, led a democratic revolution against dictatorship that was backed by the United States. And actually, his father wrote a book called The Shark and the Sardine, which was a biting analysis of U.S. imperialism in Central America and Latin America, because he was basically ousted, and along with the coup against Arbenz, they removed him, and he experienced U.S. imperialism directly. So I think the current leader, or the son, is kind of playing it moderately, just because the political climate is difficult. I mean, it might be difficult for him to survive if he position himself further to the left, so he's playing it kind of cautiously, but he does have a very progressive lineage in his family, and he said some of the right things. I don't know how he's doing since he took over, but
Yeah, I would agree with that. Earlier, someone asked a question about lawfare, and that was another good example in Guatemala, where the president of Guatemala, his party, the Semilla party, meaning seed in Spanish, that party, they tried to decertify that party and actually prevent him from becoming the president. He won the election 6 months in advance. The way their system constitutionally works, the president doesn't take office. I think he won almost in July, and then became president in December, if I got those dates kind of right. And interestingly enough, the United States was very much supporting him, and wanted to get rid of the corrupt oligarchy there, or at least encourage the new president. So I think we have to see where he lands. Like so many of these situations, it's not simply a question of personal will or desire, but really a question of the constellation of class forces. And right now, he's not in a very strong position, but he's actually the president, which is a major step forward for Guatemala.
Could I just comment on that? I think I agree with what Jeremy and Roger said. I think the interesting phenomenon is that Arevalo is part of the sort of acceptable left from the US perspective, in the way that Boric is in Chile. And in a way, Lula has to be in Brazil, just because Brazil is such an enormous economy, even though they perhaps disagree a lot with him on policy issues. And of course, in between Nicaragua and Guatemala is Honduras, where Xiomara Castro was originally part of the acceptable left, and Kamala Harris went to her inauguration when she became president, but is now kind of on the margins of being the unacceptable left, because she's aligned with China rather than Taiwan, and done various other things which aren't acceptable to the US ambassador. And the US has actually installed an ambassador in Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras, who was previously the ambassador in Managua in Nicaragua, and he's an expert in regime change techniques. And of course, that is exactly what they're perhaps not planning to do exactly, but they're working to undermine Xiomara now that she's moved from the acceptable left to the unacceptable left. And I guess Arevalo is hoping that he won't be categorized or miscategorized in a similar manner.
It just to add to that, about the ambassador, there's a joke amongst the Latin American left. The joke goes something like this: why hasn't there ever been a coup in Washington, D.C.? And the answer is there's no U.S. embassy there.
yeah. Yeah. Well, John, could you do an article for Covert Action on what you were describing in Honduras? That would be a great article.
Well, yes, yeah.
Right.
I have written about Honduras in the past. I've kind of shied away slightly from doing so under CMR's government because I think it's important to have, voices from Honduras itself. But it's tempting to have a go at it. I agree.
Yeah, okay, we'll be in touch about that. That would be great.
If you
Any,
want another collaborator on that, I have a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Kezia Gonzalez, and she's Garifuna, indigenous Honduras. And she's quite articulate and informed. If you want input from her, I could connect you.
That sounds interesting. Yeah.
I think that's the beauty of Green Renaissance sovereign rights movement, that we bring people together on topics that are important, that the media isn't focusing on. Any other questions, or should we end the video portion of tonight's meeting?
Yeah, and Roger, if you could, I don't know if you had the time to write something for Covert Action, but that would be most welcome as well. Because we can, want to expand our Latin American coverage, so.
I'd be very glad to. If you remember, we did collaborate with and Gloria too, in editing one of your articles about.
Oh yeah, that guy. Oh God, was that terrible? I forgot about that. I don't even remember his name, and let's not recite it. But there was one article that, boy, we needed an army for that one.
But yeah, Covert Action does some really great work. So thank you.
Thank you, yeah.
Jeremy is, a machine.
Yeah,
I love
and-
your
well,
last
I need to
piece
get more
on,
sunlight.
And a good friend.
on shock doctrine in Ukraine
Oh,
and
yeah,
the details around the corporate takeover.
uh-huh. Oh, yeah,
I
you
mean,
emailed me,
that's
right?
really deep and really important. So,
Now,
Thanks,
Lana's
yeah.
cool.
Yeah, I think the media is not covering that angle at all. I mean, it just gets, you do read sometime in like business news,
Jeremy,
about
do you
that,
know
but,
Alana?
well, I think we were emailing together, right, in the last
we
couple
did in
days?
just the past couple of days because I said I
Oh,
love
Yeah.
the
good.
article and I made a
And then
comment
I
on
saw,
it.
yeah, I appreciated that. And then I saw your follow-up email. So,
Yes.
yeah,
Now, she's a published author and knowledgeable on many topics.
great. Well, if you could write for Covert Action, that would be great too. Yeah.
Yeah, well, see, you pointed out both the monetary mammoths, the IMF, the World Bank, and that whole collusion system of indebtedness. And then you brought in the land grab by Monsanto and the corporate land grab. And those two always go together. The land and the
Yeah.
money problem, you pretty much need both to keep the whole concentration of wealth and the imperialist game going. Because you can't really have the money system is not going to entrap us as long as there's widespread land access and land tenure, land ownership, because you can use any kind of symbol of exchange. The thing is, can you have access to the earth to produce and to make without even having to have money? I mean, the original, everything comes from the earth. All the shelter, all the basic needs are earth based. And if you, I mean, imperialism, you go back to Kenya. The only way they could enslave the people in Kenya was to keep pushing them off the land. And then you have the slave, and we have the wage slave system going. So I think the main point, this is where I would love to have some seminar, is to look at this deep rooted ethics that's really goes back thousands of years as perennial wisdom teachings, that you cannot treat the land as a private profit and private exploitation. Private use rights, okay, but not private profiteering. And the money there cannot be this debt. Cannot be usury. And when societies have fairness in those two, land and money, then you have an equitable, stable system. And if not, you have what we have now: huge wealth concentration and a war system, and massive people in prison and homeless. So to me, it's pretty clear what we need to socialize, and the way forward to maximize individual freedoms, which is sometimes like my problem with too far left, it can tend to be centralized and no market, no freedom, too collective. So I want to see a strong, like, Green Party decentralist, tax money stays local, and then percentages from the rent from the commons up through the levels of region by region, and minimum global governance. We need some global governance, not maximum, just minimum.
Well, one of the things that I was very impressed with Nicaragua was the amount of titles that the government was giving to people. Maybe John could speak a little bit about that, because that is such an important concept.
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, in Nicaragua was unusual in that it's had a big land reform program, both in the 1980s and then more recently. In contrast, say, to Honduras, which has, still got very large tracts of land in the ownership of just a small number of families. And so that's been very successful in helping to keep people in rural areas and stem migration from the rural areas to towns, and in maintaining food sovereignty, so that Nicaragua produces 80% of its basic foodstuffs itself, as well as exporting some of them. And that's very much due to its programs to assist farmers, with low interest loans and other mechanisms. So when I was talking to the finance minister about poverty reduction, he kept on referring to rural areas, and he was referring to people, to small farmers basically, and how they were the kind of backbone of the country. So in a sense, what you were saying, Alana, about the land being so important, I think is readily recognized by the Nicaraguan government, and that's at the heart of their policies.
There's Evangelos Avalianatos. He's a Greek guy, used to work for EPA. They kept pushing him out to the margins because he was calling his attention to the problems there. He brought attention to the fact that democracy actually was not some philosophers thinking great ideas. It was really people studying how the small farms in Greece, this was a long time ago, organized and worked together. So democracy actually came out of the small farms of Greece. And then it was put into this kind of philosophical framework of democracy. But also, I mean, that's Thomas Jefferson wanted a small farm, yeoman. He said that's the basis of the democracy. And I think one of our issues goes back to the Civil War, when there was a strong push to reform, to give the plantation land to the freedmen and the poor whites, and also have enough leftover land to pay off that debt from the Civil War. That was a really big turning point. We could have had a whole different country had we had land reform for the South. You see, instead we had African Americans going into sharecrop system, paying 50% of what they worked for to a landlord, and then industrial system. So fleeing to the northern cities for jobs, Baltimore, and it's one we're really looking at right now, and all other northern cities, Detroit, so on. And then you had a shutdown of the employment, of the industrial employment, and people are trapped in utter impoverishment in the cities of the United States and then throughout the Northeast. So that it's really key, really, to and neoliberal economics. The corruption was from land, labor, and capital. Early on in the early 1900s, made the land factor, which stood for the earth itself, all the resources. In classical economics, land was all the gifts of nature. They made that a subset of capital. So our neoliberal economics is just labor and capital constantly in conflict. Whereas we fairly address the land and money problem, we would naturally have cooperatives, because who produces? People produce the wealth. So the cooperative formation would be greatly facilitated in addressing land and money problem.
I think we lost Dea, but she's part of the Freedmen movement. Bernadine and Alma, can you comment on the Freedmen movement? Okay, I think we've had some people drop off. It's a long meeting. I think I'm going to, I think Judith has her hand up. Judith, you wanna be the last comment, and then I'm going to stop the video share, and we'll just resume our normal meeting and allow
Well,
our
I don't
guests
know, but-
to either stay or run for the hills.
Okay, yeah. All right. So, Jeremy, I have posted some of your articles on Facebook and received a lot of attention, so a lot of positive attention. So, what I wanted to ask was, now that China is a competitor to the United States in terms of the economy of South America, how has that affected U.S. policy towards those countries in which China either is about to or has already played a large role? And also, what countries are now taking part in the Belt and Road Initiative? Okay.
Well, that's an excellent question. Yeah, I think John or Roger may be able to answer better than me as far as Latin American relation with China.
There's 21, as I mentioned, of the 31 countries in Latin America are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And China has become, as I mentioned, the second largest trade partner in South America after the United States. So it's had a very strong economic relationship. Most of the projects that the Chinese do in Latin America are infrastructure development projects, which are win-win solutions for those countries because their infrastructure usually, because of the colonial history, is usually backward. So it's had an overall positive effect for countries like Venezuela, Cuba, and
Who are the laborers? Are they natives or Chinese?
Let me just finish that. So for Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, the Chinese have really been a lifeline. That for instance, COVID vaccines were brought in, which were very important for those governments in terms of public health, and without the Chinese influence, and to a lesser extent Russian and interestingly Iranian influence, the countries striving for socialism in the hemisphere would not have been able to survive against the assaults from the hegemon to the north.
Yeah. So who are the laborers? Are they natives or Chinese or
Right.
both?
So the Chinese, in terms of their bilateral relationships, well, let me put it the other way. When there's bilateral relationships with the United States usually imposes terms on them about privatization, about international property and stuff like that. The Chinese have a different approach to this in Latin America and probably elsewhere, but I'll speak to Latin America. The Chinese do not interfere in the internal relations of the countries. So if the country has a capitalist system, the Chinese doesn't say, well, you have to become socialist or adopt our form of economic development. We will work with you. And so it's a non-interventionist situation, as opposed to the U.S. system, which is interventionist and says, you have to support domestic capitalism and stuff like that. So in that context, you'll see that the Chinese do not impose their model on other countries.
But Roger, you're not answering her question. When there's projects, is it the workers that are Chinese brought in to do it, or are they employing the local population?
Most of these projects are with local labor, but sometimes they also bring in Chinese labor. And I think you'd want to look at that as on a case-by-case situation.
And how has the competition from China affected U.S. policy towards these countries?
Oh, the United States has made China their the pivot to Asia has become the United States' single obsession, not only in Asia, but also in Latin America. The United States is putting extreme pressure on countries to reject China. And John alluded to that with the Xiomara Castro government in Honduras, which until when Juan Orlando Hernandez was president, the previous president, they had recognized Taiwan. And then Xiomara Castro recognized China and kicked out the Taiwanese, much to the dismay of the United States. And it's not easy to go against the tide when the United States is still the hegemon of the hemisphere. John, do you want to add to that, or Jeremy?
I think your summary was very good, Roger. I mean, you're right in the sense that when China becomes a partner, whether it's a trade partner or a partner in terms of development projects, it's a real partner. So it's doing what the country wants. It may be lending its money to do the things in the way that the US would lend money, or the multilateral bodies would lend money, but it doesn't put these ridiculous conditions on. And it's also worth mentioning that a lot of the US aid money, or the money spent by US government funded bodies in Latin America, is not about development anyway. It's about so-called democracy promotion, which means basically, it's propaganda work in favor of governments or oppositions that are aligned with the US. So the US spent tens of millions in Nicaragua up to 2018, and none of it was going to development projects to help the poor. It was all going into anti-government operations, and the same, of course, would apply in Venezuela or Cuba and many other places.
I have one more question, if you care to answer. What role is Israel playing in Latin, Central, and South America?
That one is a very good question. I think all three of us will have things to say, but let me kick it off. Israel plays a major role. It has always played a major role. And I'll say my view is that there is no daylight between Zionism and US imperialism. That's not just my view, it's President Biden's view. He repeats it all the time. And we shouldn't sort of think of Israel here and the United States there. They work in tandem. And when sometimes the Congress will take a liberal, progressive stance on restraining US imperialism, then Israel comes in. And Israel has been the trainer of all the right-wing paramilitary, well, I shouldn't say all, but it's been the trainer of right-wing paramilitary groups, particularly in Colombia, and it has been the source of military equipment for right-wing governments. And I could go on all day, but wherever the United States is there, its partner Israel is there as well. And I'll turn over to the other two friends, because they probably have a lot of examples as well.
Yeah, I'll just say something about Nicaragua and Israel. Nicaragua's a rather strange country in some respects, because it maintains relations with everybody. So although it's joined South Africa in the International Court of Justice action against Israel and what's happening in Gaza, it still maintains relations with Israel. And for example, it maintains relations with both North Korea and South Korea. So Nicaragua is a little bit odd that it's got a sort of diplomatic policy, which is to keep relations with everybody. But it has to be said that I'm not aware of any nefarious action by Israel in Nicaragua. That's not to say that there hasn't been any, but certainly there's been a lot in Central America in general, especially in Honduras during the Juan Orlando Hernandez government.
Perhaps you could also comment on Nicaragua's long and close relationship to Palestine.
Oh, indeed, yes, a very close relationship, which is why it's been joining the court action. So it's very much in solidarity with Palestine. But I think, yes, you're quite right, Roger. What you said applies throughout Central America. The Israelis in the other Central American countries have very much been on the side of the US foreign policy.
I see Ed has
If
his
I could
hand
just
up.
add John, so what were the Israelis doing to support Juan Orlando Hernandez?
I don't know the details, but I understand that they were helping him with surveillance systems, basically. And of course, surveillance was crucially important to him, both politically and in his activities as a drug runner for the cartels who were trying to get cocaine to the United States, who were getting cocaine to the United States. And of course, his trial starts in a few days' time.
Oh, really?
I don't know
Well,
whether the
that'll be a
Israeli
good story
connections.
for us to cover. Yeah, I might do an article on that trial. Yeah.
I see Ed has his hand up.
Yeah. All right. When we look at foreign relations, we see Biden doing all this whack stuff. We also know that Trump killed an Iraqi general. So, when we take a look at the polls and stuff, it looks like Trump's going to win. Do you think that if Trump becomes president, it's going to have any effect on what do you think? Do you think anything will change in terms of the relationships of what's going on between U.S. and these countries that you specialize in? Go ahead. Maybe also you don't Democrats.
I'll say no.
Democrats with the
Actually,
environmental industry
under the
and
Donald,
Republicans with the oil industry. So they might
we-
line up in different ways. I'm done. Thank you.
there was a Trumpian piece that he concocted in his 4 years, but I don't expect we're not deluded here about Donald Trump, so I don't think we should waste too much time on him. But truck out.
If we look at the record, of course, right now, like Trump is not an unknown quantity. He was president for 4 years. Then Biden and is now president. We could look at the Trump era and we could look at the Biden era, and we could say, is there differences? And there are differences. I think it'd be a mistake to say they're the same. But I think what we're seeing is a trajectory of U.S. imperialism, which has become more virulent, more aggressive, and more militaristic. And so in some ways, we see that I never thought I'd be nostalgic for Donald Trump, but in some ways, Trump treated immigrants to the United States a little bit better than Biden did in terms of deportations and stuff and actions against immigrants. So, but I think the core question is there fundamental differences? And I think there is no fundamental differences between the two. There are differences in tactics, the differences in style, but I don't think we'd expect much relief from U.S. imperialism, regardless of who is president. And we saw that particularly in Cuba, where Mr. Biden actually campaigned to reinstate the Democratic Party's opening to Cuba. But as soon as he became president, that became, a dead letter. And in fact, Biden has increased the sanctions against Cuba to Nicaragua. Biden has sanctioned Cuban flights to Nicaragua. So we don't see a relief from U.S. imperialism, at least I don't, by who's in the White House.
Well, what I found interesting under Trump was the firing of John Bolton. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of pressure on Trump to invade Venezuela, and instead he fired Bolton. And I thought that was interesting. I don't know how you guys feel about that. Any comments?
Well, I would. Yeah, John has his hand up, but there's John too. There's two Johns. John Olson has his hand up. John Olson should go.
Okay, okay, briefly here. Then, of course, there's the third option. Half the population is independent, and Bobby Kennedy's running and picking up steam. And we know he's bad on the Gaza situation, but he hasn't said much about South America other than the border crisis, which he's taken on very thoroughly. But has he talked about Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, South America in general? Any insights into that?
I think he seems to be avoiding those topics because I did some writing for the Kennedy Beacon, but then I submitted an article on Cuba, but they in the end didn't want to publish it, and I got the sense that he's shying away from those topics because he doesn't want to alienate any voters who might be. I think he's going for the kind of middle of the road voters, so he doesn't want to come across as too radical or left leaning, is the impression I got.
Well, what he might do then is to say, let's reconsider. Let's look at these failed policies of oppression, and there's things that he could do to still sound moderate, as he could certainly with Gaza. I'm very disgusted with his position there, being on with Israel. It's real. I mean, he could say, yeah, we support Israel's right to exist and we hate the Hamas attack, but let's at least consider the population of Palestine people. Come on. I mean, I think we're all on board with that he's been bad on that.
Okay, Chuck has his hand up.
What? Oh, I'm gonna pass right. I got to collect my thoughts again. I'll be right back. I'm gonna take my hand down.
All right, are we all set with questions?
I think Roger Harris was going to answer that question before Chuck intervened.
What was the question, Judy?
About Trump.
What's your thoughts on Trump? Is that the question?
Oh, on Trump with John Bolton, that there was a point where it really felt like Trump was being railroaded into invading Venezuela, and instead of doing that, he just fired Bolton.
Well, but he had hired Bolton in the first place. I mean,
Yeah, but
he's kind of all
I don't
over
think
the
he
map.
knew.
I mean,
Yeah, but I don't think Trump really understood international affairs until he was like in the middle of it. I mean, that's kind of
but
my
he's
view on
pretty.
him.
Right.
I think he, kind of is pretty aggressive when it comes to Latin America. I think like in Europe or in Ukraine, he might pull back a bit. But when it comes to South America, he seems to pick up the Reagan mantle, and he's very rails against the socialist governments and use the kind of Reagan-esque rhetoric. So I think he's pretty dangerous for South America.
But what
Trump.
happened to Bolton?
Well, he was pretty aggressive in general, his policy toward Venezuela, Trump administration. So, I mean, he brought Bolton in.
Yeah, but then he gave Bolton the axe.
Yeah,
So
I think we just gotta give Trump a few points here. He did kick Bolton out. He did make more peace than he made war. And I live in the Republican T, okay? The Republican T of Pennsylvania. 2/3 of the people are Republicans. I grew up in a Republican family. I once talked to the chair of the Republican Party when I was running for Congress as a Green Party person. And he was for the local elections. I was asking about oil and the oil corporations. He said, big government, big oil. Same thing he said. So a lot of the sentiment around supporting Trump, and I know because most of my neighbors, is they don't like the central government in Washington, D.C. So what an opportunity for the Green Party and the message of decentralism. How do we actually withdraw power from this corrupt and overweighted government in Washington, D.C.? That's how we build movements beyond right and left. We affirm that that's why people like Trump, because he has a big mouth against the power structure. And he probably doesn't know what to do about it. And that's where we come in. How do you deconstruct the centralized power structure in Washington, D.C.? The hegemon. The hegemon. That's our duty here in the belly of the beast. That's the conversations we need to have. And I think we need to forget the delusion that we're going to somehow elect somebody that's going to fix it for us from Washington, D.C., that power center. It ain't going to happen, in my view.
Well, so
Yeah, that's good.
Elena, I just want to riff off of that, and I'm remembering what I wanted to talk about or just ask about. Just if I may, just a very brief connect with, what's the criticism of the military-industrial complex, and what you're describing tonight is its power in Central America and controlling states and so on. So, I'm grappling with the position of being anti-war, but in the case that you're describing, it's not so much war; it's more like regime change tactic by the power the American power elite. But behind that all is the CIA and the military-industrial complex. So the only, I think the answer to that has to be a very strong pro-peace message that says, that demands a stand down from the military-industrial complex, from this, kind of call out the power play that they're doing, and just kind of make a universal declaration of stand down as a tactic to speak to the problem of this power elite that is the military-industrial complex. So instead of being anti-war in our opposition to Gaza, I think we need to be, as Elena's saying, speak to the possibilities, call that the peace that we're seeking, and then start holding war crimes tribunals of the people that are that are committing state crimes. That's a tactical play, that our movement should be making. Check out.
I'm just going to let our panelists answer this, and it's 10:13, so I'm going to stop recording because I think everyone's kind of getting tired. And sometimes we veer off after a few hours. So if anyone want to respond to Chuck, and then I'll end the recording.
Hello, it's me, Judy. Yeah, I wanted to ask the three experts. Well, we all know that in the United States, the president has no actual power, that he's just a tool of the main corporations. And but it seems that that in Latin America there might be some kind of power that the presidents do have, judging by the fact that they're so anxious to get rid of some leftists or slightly leftists. So can you address how much power relative to the situation which is controlled by the main capitalist corporations and the imperialist needs of America relative to South America? How much power does the president actually have? Okay.
John, why don't you take a stab at that for Nicaragua?
Well, in Nicaragua's case, I think the president has a lot of power, but it's a very small country. We're only 7 million people, and the presence of big multilaterals is really quite small. I mean, there are, Cargill is here and various other US-led multilateral businesses. Walmart has got one shop here and owns a supermarket chain, for example. But I suppose it's an unusual system because the government is quite centralized, but also there is a vibrant cooperative movement. And because we've had a revolution, people are engaged at local level, and there is an expectation of involvement at local level amongst people who been through a revolutionary process. And the army is a revolutionary army, and the police is a revolutionary police force. So Nicaragua rather stands out in the way that, say, Cuba does, because we've had a revolution and therefore a transformation. And sadly, in most of the rest of Latin America, that doesn't apply.
Okay, I'd like to thank our now three experts, and especially Roger and John Perry and Jeremy Kuzmarov for joining us tonight, joining Green Renaissance Sovereign Rights Movement as we study the different issues that are affecting us in the United States, and that we as citizens of the United States and residents of the United States end up funding in other countries with our tax dollars, with our purchases, and with our debt. And thank you very much, gentlemen, and also our members from Green Renaissance for joining us tonight. I'm going to stop the recording, and then we can continue if we want to just chat. Thank you.